Have you got big questions about God? Are you wrestling with doubts?
Welcome to Questioning Christianity.
We believe that truth invites questioning, and that faith is not a blind leap in the dark,
but a response to the light of God's revelation.
So whether it's God's hiddenness or history,
science or scripture,
ethics or evidence,
purpose or pain,
we create content to take questioners and their questions seriously.
We talk with scholars for expert insights and lay out the reasons why Christianity is worth believing.
Questioning Christianity.
Connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions.
All right, well, welcome back to Questioning Christianity. If you haven't joined us before, I'm Dan Patterson, and this channel is all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. Today, I'm joined by a very old friend, not old in years, but we go back long enough, Dr. Dave Benson. Dave, great to have you on the channel.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's a privilege and a real joy because, as you said, we've known each other for so long. So I'm delighted in just watching how things are unfolding with QC.
Yeah. So for those who have no idea of the heritage of our story, Dave was the youth pastor at Kemmel Baptist Church, which is the church I started attending really when I came to faith in Jesus. And he had an enormous influence on my life. He was the one that I would pester with questions. We'd catch up for coffee every week, be teaching me how to read the Bible. He gave me in my first year of being a Christian a page of books that I was meant to be able to start working through of reading. And so if this library behind you intimidates you in any way, the one behind me, it's pretty much Dave's fault in just helping me take my questions seriously and dig into the Christian story, ask away with my questions. And you were the kind of, I guess, origin story for me doing public talks as well. Because in that capacity where I started volunteering with the church and exploring gospel ministry, Dave would take me along into the local high school and we'd do talks at lunchtimes or chaplaincy programs, or for Christian schools, actually doing apologetics talks on the reliability of the New Testament or truth and worldviews and even preaching in church. I think my first gig preaching in a Sunday service was as part of an apologetics message that we did with Logos. And so all of those beginnings, small, humble beginnings, has sort of led to Questioning Christianity today. Dave also married my wife and I, so he officiated.
That sounds really dodgy, Dad.
Aaron and I. So yeah, it's good fun to play around with people. I always say things like, "Oh, I married my sister," or "I married those people," or whatever. And people are like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Well, it's the official language. Like that is the right verbiage to use." But so Dave's been an enormous influence in my life, and just by way of understanding where he fits into this conversation around apologetics, Dave did his master's in Christian thought after an undergrad in education, actually over in Vancouver, in Canada, and got to study Christian apologetics under people like John Stackhouse and others that were there at the time. Was J.I. Packer still lecturing theology when you were there?
I did have a couple of lectures from him, and his mind was still sharp. He would look up to the top left corner and just draw down a whole filing cabinet of history to do with the Puritans, and then just launch in. So, yeah, it was a wonderful education at Regent.
Amazing. And then has gone on to do a PhD in public theology at the University of Queensland. Dave taught apologetics at seminary here in Australia for close to a decade, really, and then has spent the last 5 years over in the UK working for the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, really as the director of discipleship, or sort of looking at whole of life discipleship, forming Christian
discipleship.
Yeah. So he's got a wealth of experience that he brings to this conversation. Dave's also been heavily involved with the Lausanne movement. When I went to the Younger Leaders Gathering back in 2016, Dave was the program director with others there, helping to shape the content and the messaging for the week, and just did that more recently for the gathering that was in Seoul in Korea, last year or 2 years ago. So
2024.
A real taste of kind of global Christianity that comes in with that experience as well. So Dave, I'm enormously privileged to have you on today as we want to dive into not so much the content of apologetics, which is all the different questions that people raise and the objections that they have towards Christianity or the arguments in favor of the Christian story, but is more opening the hood, so to speak, to explore how apologetics is taking place. About 2 years ago, I think I did a public lecture down in Sydney for a seminary called The End of Apologetics, ? because with cultural shifts that were happening at the time, there wasn't a ton of openness towards Christianity. There was a lot of hostility. There were political movements that were attached with that, laws that were changing. So there was just this vibe that maybe the old style of persuasion and of offering reasons for Christianity was kind of fading away, and that we just needed to do more of the public proclamation in a very bold way, and then just take the hits and be willing to face whatever comes.
That's an approach.
But that's been a huge reversal in the last couple of years. That was one of the most failed predictions I think I've ever seen. Just with the rise of the new theists, a ton of high-profile secular thinkers and podcasters and communicators engaging with Christianity, interested with Christianity, some even becoming Christians, and of apologists like my mate Wes getting a huge platform all of a sudden to really address all the common questions that you were tackling a long time ago, but some new ones as well. And so with this renewed interest kind of in apologetics, there's maybe a spotlight that comes on the entire enterprise. And that's what we want to dig into today, is just doing a bit of a health check on the state of apologetics and ask questions. Where does it need to be strengthened? What needs to change? What do we need to be aware of? And maybe if you're a younger guy or girl that's looking in on this and thinking, you know what, I want to do apologetics and aspire to the same kind of commendation of the gospel, maybe just some wisdom that we can impart, and particularly too for pastors that are listening in. So maybe let me begin with this question. I've heard it said from a number of higher profile Christian academics, and people you might even call Christian advocates, in that they do public theology, say that apologetics itself is a dirty word. And certainly it's become a bit of a smear. Whenever you hear the word apologist for something, it almost sounds like they've got a predetermined conclusion and they're just using all kinds of underhanded methods to try and sell you a product. Do you think apologetics is a legitimate enterprise, and should we try and revive the word itself so that it represents something healthy?
Yeah, look, I'm a bit of an originalist. I always like going back to what words mean, and apologetics, as like you've talked about so much on this channel, apologetics isn't apologizing for Christianity, and it's not making someone sorry that they asked you about your faith either. So it's not berating someone. It's not trying to simply persuade them. Personally, I don't actually like the framing of persuasion as apologetics. I'm not saying that's not part of it, but in my mind, the goal of apologetics relates very much to the words apologia, to not reason away, but to put forth the reasons that you have a hope within, which is that classic 1 Peter 3:15. And as I chatted with a friend of mine the other day, the reasons that I have for the hope within are not the same as the reasons that you have or the reason that someone else has. It's tied very deeply to your context and to your story. So the apologetic that you give when someone says, why do you believe, why do you act that way, why are you living that way, that it should draw forth something that is authentic to your own personality, your own background. I wouldn't expect someone who hadn't studied philosophy to be using the Kalam cosmological argument as giving the reason that they hold their faith when it's not actually the reason they hold their faith. So I think that's one of the things that I have an issue with in it, is that my aim is not persuasion in general, or wheeling out some classic argument that is an old trope. It's actually the art of conversation to help the other understand why I believe and act the way that I do in following Christ, who I believe to be good news. And toward that end, I think that never grows old. The idea that I can simply throw out the gospel and just put out the claims there and never actually respond to honest questions with honest answers, as Francis Schaeffer used to put it with the L'Abri movement, shelter for honest questions. I think that that's just arrogance. Like if I have a conversation with someone and they ask, you know, what do you love or what do you believe? And I share that. And then they say, why do you believe that? Or how can you believe that? And I go, no, sorry, I don't want to talk about that. I just want to put the claim out there. I think that was the criticism, maybe unfairly so, but that was a criticism of some of the schools of theology against Karl Barth in terms of his kind of neo-reformed approaches. They said you're just throwing the gospel like a stone into the water and just letting the ripples come, but you're not actually engaging with your neighbor. And it's not simply you ask a question, I give the answer. It's actually we both have questions, we both have answers. And in a divine conversation where I'm sensitive to the Spirit, something emerges that neither of us could have predicted before coming in. And so I think as long as we come with that integrity and a posture of listening, apologetics is a great thing. But I don't see it necessarily as an academic specialization. I see it as a deploying of all of the riches and tools associated with the reasons for the hope that we have.
Well, maybe then some of the critique is coming from experiences of seeing apologetics done poorly, or of the industrialization, like you say, of apologetics as some kind of major specialty in parachurch ministry that seems detached from everyday Christians and seems detached from the local church. And we can maybe speak to that, but there certainly are some maybe warning signs where apologetics has become unhealthy. And maybe that's in the kind of gleaning for our conversation today. There were a number of questions that people wanted me to throw your way. And one of them was on this feature of just the pitfalls then that maybe we identify within contemporary apologetics. What might give rise to the concern that apologetics is a dirty word, or that it's an inherently flawed enterprise? And maybe if I could kick off the top 5 and have you speak to this. I think sometimes it is that you have a professionalization of generalists, in that you often have people without academic training in certain areas representing arguments in a way as though they know what they're talking about. But as soon as they get pressed back from people within the field, you realize, well, this isn't really solid, what you're saying, or well researched. So you can have critical Bible scholars who aren't believers in God or believers in Jesus just look at the contents of a lot of contemporary apologetics and say, wait a second, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and start to ask critical questions. That kind of then leads people to question whether or not the comments that they're hearing from this apologist, they can trust anything that they're saying. Do they really know what they're talking about? Is that a dynamic that you've seen too?
Yeah, absolutely. And my good friend who you know as well, Bruce Blackshaw, he calls for humble apologetics, or honest apologetics. And what he means by honest apologetics is actually being honest about how much we know, our background, our, I guess, our credentials to speak into a question. Because oftentimes people can speak overly confidently about something that they've never even trained in. And that quickly is exposed as a sham. Now, I sit on the fence with this in some ways, because I'm conscious as an academic that I've heard many academics, and I think this is good practice, say, you know, they get asked a question and they say, that's not my lane. In other words, that's not where I've done my study. And if you want me to speak as just another person in the room, I'm happy to, but I don't want you as the listener to put more weight on that than it can bear, because that's not what I've actually studied in. I've studied in this, and they've got lane drift instead. You know, I can speak to every lane. So I think you need to be rhetorically humble as well, to be able to acknowledge what you know and what you don't know. I can speak about some of the original languages, but that's not an area of specialization for me. And so if I'm going to get into it, I need to show my sources and also state the level of confidence that I have in that. And I think that's really helpful to do. At the same time, though, I remember in my master's, I had the chance to read through all of the works of Francis Schaeffer, and I'm still quite shaped by the way he approached things. But one of the critiques was he makes a caricature of history, connecting dots that aren't even connected, to tell a more compelling, comprehensive narrative of how we got to where we are, of the ideological drip down of different beliefs through society from philosophy on. And actually any decent historian would say you've connected 50 dot points that really have no direct connection to each other, and you've drawn this picture that suits what you want to see. You've caricatured existentialism, and you haven't even understood the sources. You've not mentioned Soren Kierkegaard, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I always thought, yeah, Schaeffer does overstate. But then I looked at it and said, because some said you're not engaging with academic sources, but the reality was he wrote his books out of real life conversations where he's not engaging some academic or some abstract ideology. He's actually engaging a real person. And when he engages that real person, he needs to take seriously where they're coming from. He would often say, I'll listen for 55 minutes to get their context, and then I'll share something of the hope of the gospel in the last 5 minutes. I hope he did that in practice, not just as a nice quote. But what that means is he's taking them and their beliefs seriously. And if they hold a caricature of a philosophy, then in one sense, he might correct their caricature, but he's better to actually engage where they're coming from, because that's what that particular person holds. So there's a danger. You're trying to skirt between the Scylla and the Charybdis. You're trying to get between the Scylla of showing that you're all-knowing and you get it all, but on the other side, you don't want to become elitist, that you're basically saying, I can only speak to anything if I've done a PhD in it. And that's not the nature of conversation.
Yeah, I really like what Clive's just put in the chat as well. He says,
Mm.
let's not lean towards the tyranny of experts either.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
There's this maybe opposite danger where sometimes there's almost a academic consensus that is appealed towards, when sometimes that academic consensus is more based on groupthink or on ideological bias within a field rather than on solid reasoning. And I've often heard underdogs make really good arguments that are far more compelling than the academic case. And this isn't just in something that where I'm biased towards the answer, but I'm like, actually, yeah, you know what, that makes far more sense than the kind of case where you would say the majority of experts align on that particular issue, having listened to their case as well. Yeah.
Let's be frank, most experts bore people to death. I mean, sometimes you could bore people to death by moving so slowly through an argument. It's precise, but it's not life-giving. And conversation should be real.
And sometimes there are fields, like let's say something like the fine-tuning of the universe, for instance. That is a field in which I am definitely not an expert when it comes to the scientific data. So that's where I get Luke Barnes, mate from Sydney, to come in to speak to that, because that is his PhD research area, his master's research area. He's literally written the book on it. But when it comes to more of the philosophical and then theological applications of it, that is something that I'm quite studied in. And so you're more helping to say, okay, where is the training in argumentation, in theological conclusions that I maybe do have an ability to maybe just put out cleanly. And it may be more to a lay level in terms of where people engage on this stuff, but that's really where it ultimately matters. It's taking complex ideas and actually communicating them to a level where it has value in how people are processing life and meaning and whether or not God's real and all of this. So I do think maybe there are those warnings. Certainly don't speak outside of what you know, and so do damage the gospel when that gets exposed. But also, and in being humble, do be willing to make good arguments. If you think the case lines up there, then put forward the argument and be open to being corrected. But maybe don't shrink back just because you don't have PhD letters behind your name from being able to make a good case as well. What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree. And maybe I'll kind of tangent off that. But one of the other things is posture. And maybe this will come up in another pitfall in contemporary apologetics. I see so many people who think that apologetics is about grabbing the microphone and presenting a talk. But in my mind, it is first and foremost dialogical. It's a conversation. And the posture of that conversation is not me versus you, or my arguments versus your argument, or my echo chamber and your echo chamber suddenly collide, and then we need to prove that we're the strongest. I actually see it very differently. Imagine if we were sitting together in the same room and we had a dining room table between us, and you're thinking about a particular question, and you're coming from one angle on that side of the table, and let's put that question on the center of the table. It's not about you and me per se, but we're conversing together to see more than one of us could see because we're coming from a certain angle. And I put mine on the table as well. And then we have a discussion about what do we see when we look at this from our different angles. So I'll lean into that rather than trying to show a knockdown argument as though I can persuade someone by bullying them into, admission that this is right. I actually think that works against the posture of responding to God. And if the aim is that we would open up a personal connection with God, personalism is the kind of apologetic approach that one of the previous Catholic popes was talking about, is if the posture is humbly coming to a person and responding and aligning with them, then you don't serve that by abstract evidences that don't actually relate to the posture of your heart. And if you engage in that argument in a way that hardens their heart to prove their position or to concede, that's not actually helpful. So what I'll do is I'll say, I don't know, here's how I see that, but help me understand how you see it. And then I'll do my best to say, I really appreciate that point. I think that's helpful. I guess maybe I'm coming from this angle, or have you thought about? So it's a genuine conversation. I'm not posturing. I'm not trying to control. The aim is to look together from different angles at the same evidence, the same questions, and to try and leave the other person better than you found them, and they better leave you in that sense as well. So I see it as mutual engagement towards a greater goal of truly seeing the world as it actually is, and finding something that doesn't just make sense intellectually, but that leads to life.
Yeah, I was really moved. Even just recently, I was having a conversation with Joe Schmid from Majesty of Reason. He's a young philosopher, a very brilliant mind. He's already co-published a series of papers with some of the best living philosophers in religion. So he's just doing his PhD candidacy now. But the whole conversation was on the divine hiddenness question of, if God is perfectly loving, then we should expect there should be no non-resistant non-believers. And as the person more representing the skeptical side of this argument and the various dimensions that he wanted to bring out, I was just moved by different points in the conversation where Joe would very humbly just say, I like that idea, or I think that's a good point, or just a willingness to give ground where you feel like I'm not just batting for a team and therefore have to reject everything else that's said from the other direction. It's like, no, if I'm a follower of Jesus, then all truth is God's truth. And Jesus said, those on the side of truth, listen to me. We should be representing the truth as it comes to us in the best way that we possibly can, and giving ground where we feel like we were wrong and repenting of that, or admitting that and changing our mind, or just saying, you know what, that's a really helpful point of view or perspective. And I just want to acknowledge that and totally see where you're coming from. I think it's honest and real and more Christian, but I also just think it's just a more helpful way to engage people in conversation too, where you're not a brick wall that they're bumping into on every single point, but you are tempering your levels of certainty and confidence based on the kind of points and arguments that we're making.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the frustrations, and it's not at all directed at you in this, Dan, but even if you're thinking of the metaphors we live by, the metaphor we often use in apologetics is giving ground. Where's that come from? Military. I have certain ground. You've taken some by secularism or some other religion, and I need to get it back. Or batting. That's two teams opposing each other trying to get a win. It's competition. My picture is actually, we are in a genuine conversation, and my goal is to love you. My goal is to listen. My goal is to help you become more truly yourself. And in the process, I will share authentically and in good faith where I'm coming from, and I hope you do the same. And so if I feel in a conversation that it is taking on the dynamic of an oppositional kind of posture, I'll actually pull back at that point and say, hey, can I just be clear? This conversation, from my perspective at least, is trying to better understand each other and help each other become better versions of ourselves, to better align with the way the world might actually be, that we're trying to access through the handle of our beliefs, our worldview, etc. My aim is not to dominate, to dismiss, to demean. If that's your goal, I don't know if we can have this conversation in good faith. Can we just recalibrate here? And so I find, if your posture in apologetics is, I want to grab the microphone and make a slam down argument that every right-thinking person will somehow believe, then I think you're probably doing violence to the nature of the gospel.
Do you think that maybe, if we were to speak to another pitfall, is a scary feature of online engagement, in that we do have a world that politically is becoming more partisan, rhetorically, just in how people engage for the sake of entertainment, is becoming more partisan? Is one of the pitfalls just the mode of engagement that you're seeing now across social media and YouTube world? And I'd love you to speak to that.
Yeah, I had a number of years back, and goodness knows, maybe I'll even watch the video, but a guy named Mark, so we used to do these open table events where basically we'd have a dinner on a certain theme. I don't know how he came across me, but he was trolling me, like seriously trolling me. I'd never met the guy, and he was just trying to flame everything I contributed. And normally I'm trying to find a mediating perspective. And anyway, so I just did some background research to work out who on earth is this guy. Worked out he was a friend of a friend. Used to be a brilliant architect, but changed gear, went into primary school education, but he'd clearly been burned by the church. And so he just wanted to go for anyone that was trying to make any solid argument to do with anything. And I suddenly realized, actually, he lives within Brisbane. He's on the other side of Brisbane. So I just contacted him on Messenger and said, hey, Mark, totally fine that if you want to keep burning me, but I said, I noticed that we actually live in the same city. Would you desperately mind if we found a time to catch up? Not to argue. I just want to understand you and where you're coming from. So I drove the 50 minutes across the other side of the city. We had a coffee together. I got to see his house. Turns out his wife was actually responsible for holding the Catholic charisma in one of the schools. I don't know how that works in a marriage when your spouse is pretty devout. And out of that conversation, he would still flame me on occasion, but we knew each other and there was a respect. And he would then actually come across to a couple of the gatherings that we did and share from his perspective. And we welcomed that in telling his own story. And again, the medium, the algorithms and everything tilts us towards short, sharp responses that read the worst in the other person, that are clickbait worthy, all of these things radically reduce the process of trying to make sense of the world and converse for the love of your neighbor, reduces it down to a battle. And I think that means, like, I've never gone into Twitter or X, partly for that reason, that I find you should simplify as far as possible, but no further. And we're constantly being simplistic in the way that we're engaging. And I think a lot of heat comes out of that, but not much light. So I think when we put things forward, it doesn't mean you've got to be long-winded. I have hit the so-called Benson limit on Facebook by putting too many characters in a post and it telling me to go back again. But I think you can be succinct, but tone things in a way that leads to more light than heat.
Is there, though, to maybe push back on that, I can imagine some people listening going, wait a second, doesn't the New Testament frame the experience of Christians as though they are in conflict? There is truth and there is lies, there is good, there is evil, there is dark, there is light. Is this too much of a simplistic frame then of just a loving conversation with others when there really is a war at play for people's minds and souls? Like, how would you react to that kind of concern?
Yeah, I would acknowledge there is a war. I just say that the enemy is not my neighbor. And the way that we fight that war is by outloving evil with good. So we've got confused about what our weapons are and who the enemy is, if that's the case. I love the quote from Abraham Lincoln, which I think was riffing off Jesus: do I not destroy my enemy when I make them my friend? So I think we fight not with the weapons of the world, but we fight with the power of a sound mind. We fight with love. So if we understand the nature of the battle, I don't actually represent my king, who was the Prince of Peace, the lamb that was slain on the throne. I don't represent him particularly well when I go in and damn my neighbor or demean them or make them angry because I won an argument. I remember one of my old profs saying that when he went to see someone do an apologetics gig, and he said the guy was brilliant, but he heard someone coming out saying he might have been right, but damned if I'd ever follow him. In other words, his attitude was so proud that it just put everyone off. You're not winning a war by doing that. So yeah, there is a battle of light and dark in that kind of binary Johannine gospel kind of setting, but we engage it through love that looks like our Messiah, who humbled himself and at times stood silent like a sheep before its shearers. There's time for silence as well. There's a time, as Dallas Willard used to do, of giving your neighbor the last word and blessing them in the process and not needing to fight for airtime. I think our posture should be gracious throughout and humble, and the way that we love is our greatest apologetic. The way that we love each other, both Christians loving each other, but also the way I love my neighbor, is the greatest apologetic. It's an ecclesial apologetic that makes God known. The Kalam, great. Ontological, great. Teleological arguments, great. The greatest apologetic is the way we love each other. Yeah. No, I don't mind these arguments, but if they're not rallied together in a way that truly loves our neighbor, we've sold the farm.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's maybe a push people feel almost like when you're in any kind of public engagement, that's certainly true in social media space, that you need to represent the team in the debate. And mostly you end up playing to the echo chamber rather than actually reaching across the aisle and trying to persuade anyone else. And I think we've got some great advice I remember from my mate Sam Albury, who said, whenever I'm speaking, I'm not imagining the theological gatekeepers in the room. I'm not imagining those who might fund the organization that I work for. I'm imagining my 15-year-old self who was wrestling with what I was wrestling with, my doubts, my questions, my barriers towards being able to believe in God. And that's the person to whom I'm directing what I'm saying most. And I just think we need to be very cautious in this contemporary environment about where are our words being directed, who are we trying to influence in a healthy way. So there's another dynamic that
there you go. I was just going to add to that. When we used to do the apologetics talks, originally it was defending the faith was the frame that we had. When I went to Regent College, I returned from that and renamed it Logos. Because I realized that the posture of defending was kind of kicking people out from taking us down. I was speaking to insiders about Christian perspectives, and if a non-Christian friend were ever to watch the video of what I shared, they would have felt objectified. But when I returned, I thought actually that John 1:9 of Christ is the true light who gives light to all people and has come into the world, though we couldn't perceive it, that actually everything true, good, and beautiful is held in Christ. And the posture is not defense or attack. The posture is illuminate and reveal. And that starts with love. And so we used to then say, every time we write a talk, we write it for the non-Christian, from a range of perspectives, maybe spiritual but not religious, or atheistic or from another religion, we write the talk as though it's a conversation with them. I will never present to a Christian group as though I'm simply speaking to Christians from my team about the other on the other team. I'll actually frame it in the way of I'm picturing myself in conversation with the other and trying to model a healthy dialogue. And you then achieve the same goals for the insider anyway, because they get to see what it looks like to engage with grace and truth at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other comments that was made in lead up to this conversation was from a friend I've made over the years, mostly online, but we've caught up a couple of times in person, a guy called Richard Suttles. You might know him online as the Faithiest Atheist or the Fallen Ape Theist, but he works in counterterrorism, got a fascinating story. But Richard, I just think I appreciate is how honestly he engages with Christians. And he has some really healthy critiques of the kind of apologetics subculture that he sees, particularly within North American evangelicalism. But one of his comments was around his concern that in contemporary apologetics, a lot of people are being drawn away from what their initial impulse was, which was to commend Jesus as good news and to help bring illumination on how his answers offer life in every part of the dimension of our experience. And so rather than commending and defending Jesus, they're sort of straying in every other direction, to commending and defending political parties, to commending and defending social causes, to commending and defending government action in other countries. It just feels like they're kind of strayed from their direction. Is that something you've noticed within apologetics as well, where it's become more about defending arguments and a person's credentials or their own quality of intellectual prowess, rather than actually commending the person of Jesus? And how would you speak to that concern?
I think that's entirely valid, and I think he makes a really helpful critique there. I would say, though, that our faith is never less than Jesus, the person of Jesus of Nazareth, but our faith is more than that. The gospel is that God reigns. And in order for God to reign, there's got to be a God. So it does include arguments about God's existence. There needs to be a concept of lordship, which implies that there is an ethic that we are broken and we're called to align with the kingdom of God. So that brings in ethics, that brings in politics and the public square. So I think there is a problem in just becoming a red letter Christian where you're basically just saying, I only talk about Jesus, that's all I do. I think there's multiple issues, and apologetics responds to where my neighbor is at and their questions, which could take us further afield. But I'd see it as a telos. The mountain that we're climbing, the telos of that mountain is Christ himself. And if we find ourselves doing apologetics, but we're never actually pointing to Jesus, and we couldn't give the best apologetic of all, which is, why is Jesus good news to me? Then I would be awfully suspicious of that apologist. Because I'd say, are you apologizing here for your ego? Are you trying to look like the smartest one in the room? Are you trying to make the best argument? Have you got an axe to grind? Is this for a political purpose? The telos is not politics, is not ego, is not anything else. The telos is conversing with someone so that by God's grace, they may be drawn to the beauty, the truth, the goodness of Christ himself, who is the revelation of God and embodies the reign of God. Jesus is Lord. So I think it's always a good test. It also pushes us to be prayerful in what we do, that actually we're responding to a person who God is in conversation with before I am. And if I just come and butt in and start giving all these random arguments that don't even connect to where they're at, that's rubbish. So we should be prayerful throughout. And I'm always trying to cultivate a posture through question asking of not looking for where do I give my bit, but actually what questions can I ask that draw the person out. I've taken great comfort and direction from the walk to Emmaus, Luke 24. A lot of the stuff I do has that alongside as posture. And three of my favorite questions: what do you love? What do you hate? And for what do you hope? I'll often come back to this. Almost knocked over something on my screen here. I'll come back to this in terms of, if I'm hearing someone, I'll be looking for, not just asking directly, but what animates you? Where are you most alive? And I'll try and show that actually the goodness of the gospel affirms what they love. And I'll draw out the best of that. I'll locate it in a bigger story. What do you hate? What gets you angry? What are you protecting? What are you judging here? I'll normally try and connect that to a baseline in which the world is broken and there's things that actually should be challenged. And I want to agree with you, but I might also reframe and challenge some of where you're coming from. And for what do you hope? What's your vision of the world set right? I want them to see that actually Christ is at the center of the setting right of the world, and that there is a way of their hopes being satisfied in this bigger and better story of the gospel. So I think the shift from simply a systematic or a proposition-driven apologetic that wheels out a cavalcade of evidences to instead telling the story that we're designed for good, but we've been damaged by evil, that we're restored for better in Christ. We're sent together to heal the world through the Spirit as a sign of when God sets everything right. They're just riffing off James Chong in True Story, A Christianity Worth Believing In. I know that you've included that kind of framework as well in your book on questioning Christianity. I'm always taking a narrative apologetic now and asking questions that draw out their story to locate their story within the mission of God.
Yeah, same. I've been really impacted by that kind of picture of when people say, well, what kind of ministry do you do? I'm like, well, if anything, I'm a theological apologist, because I think the resources to people's challenges, the concerns, objections, yes, you can draw from science. Yes, you can draw from history. Yes, you can draw from psychology and various other human sciences. But I think the greatest value comes in the story that God has given to us to shed light on our experiences and our doubts. And so mostly try and kind of locate it's the problem of evil or divine hiddenness, the resurrection of Jesus. It's in the Christian story itself. I think God has given us tremendous gift in being invited to wrestle with this spiritual curriculum in the scriptures to try and come to our thinking about our answers, and often without great certainty in all of the questions that we've got, but enough to know that we can trust him. And so certainly trying to draw people into the Christian story as a means of working through their questions is something I'm heavily impacted by. One thing that we talked about early on, and that I've been thankful for your example and influence over the years, has been how our spiritual lives and our character marry together with our witness. And one of the great dangers is in the last 2 decades, the number of high-profile Christian evangelical leaders, and from other Christian traditions too, but that have been exposed for having done heinous things behind closed doors or for living a very dark double life. And there's a lesser danger, but still very present, in that you see, because of the aggression with which sometimes online conversations can play out, there is the Christ-likeness that is getting beat out of people and a love that is growing cold. And so maybe one of the fifth and of the top 5 pitfalls in contemporary apologetics that I see is it is a deadening of that Christ-likeness that would weep over an unbelieving Jerusalem rather than smack down on them. Is that a dynamic you're seeing? Anything you want to speak to before we move on that?
Yeah, I think that was what, and, maybe I'll get into contentious waters here, but that was one of the concerns I had with the whole Charlie Kirk movement. And that's not to, get into the middle of that of saying this is right or that's wrong. But one of the things was, even as he showed a good democratic tone in terms of it's a liberal argument, you're kind of talking about what you believe, but it often put things in their most terse form to push the person to the extremities of their argument to be able to show that it was incoherent. And I think a lot of people felt like, I feel attacked by this. Even if he was right, I feel attacked by this. I think you mentioned earlier on the conference about the end of apologetics. There was a book by Myron Penner, who basically talked about the end of apologetics, Christian witness in a postmodern age. And one of the points he made in there, drawing on Soren Kierkegaard, is Christ doesn't call us to be experts. He doesn't call us to be the smartest in the room. He calls us to be apostles. And the apostle is a witness. The apostle, their own life embodies the witness that they're talking about. The apostle weeps over the lost person. The apostle is humble about where they come from, and they don't need to be the one who points to themselves. They point to Jesus. And I think we need more apostles in that space. We need people who their beauty of holiness in their life is actually their greatest witness, that they embody in their life and the way they act and the way they dialogue with their neighbor. They embody the grace, the spirit, and the truth of Jesus. So I think we desperately need that today.
If we were to switch gears then and just say, we've pointed out some of the things that worry us, and it's either people speaking far beyond their field of expertise and doing damage to the gospel by being shown to be wrong, or people leaning into credentialism rather than actually making good arguments and just appealing to a vague consensus rather than just putting forward a healthy case, or maybe the polarization or straying away from actually preaching Christ or looking like him. Like these are some of the big pitfalls that we're noticing. What would be healthy markers? So maybe someone's been watching Wes Huff, someone's been watching the way that he's getting around the circuit on a whole bunch of high profile podcasts, and they're thinking, man, I actually feel drawn to that. And let's say they've already done the hard work of realizing, hey, I'm drawn to that not because I want to be famous or get on a platform or have a microphone, but I'm drawn to it because I want to make a difference and I want to share Christ with the world. What would you say are 5 healthy markers of apologetics?
Well, I think one healthy marker is that love is the test of all apologetics, and that it points towards the person of Jesus. I think that's crucial. Can I honestly say that I'm loving my neighbor in the way that I'm engaging? I think honesty is a key thing, that our aim is not to persuade per se. Our aim is to be honest about the way we see things. Listening would be a healthy marker, that we actually start by truly listening to our neighbor and steel manning rather than straw manning our neighbor, that we've read their sources. If I'm engaging with someone, I'll often ask, what's the 1, 2, or 3 sources or books that you found most helpful and that best encapsulate where you're coming from? I'll take the time to read it and let's have a conversation about it. And then I'll always lead off with something I appreciate. So I won't simply look to challenge, but I'll look for what can I affirm and where do I see that located within the larger story of the kingdom of God. So I think the listening is pretty key. I think another healthy marker is prayer, that we actually are praying for the people that we're going to share with and that we take their context very seriously. I think another thing is that we should always be in a dialogue between the word, the world, and one another. Often call this triple listening, building on John Stott's double listening, that we listen to the word, we're bringing the scriptures and what they say, particularly in narrative theology, informed by that larger theological vision. That's always central. We always bring it back to the norming norm of the scriptures. I think sometimes people try and form almost like stones in a river that aren't even heading to the right path, but as long as it feels like we're moving them forward, that's a good thing. And then you just throw that marker away because that wasn't a particularly well-formed theological perspective. I think any argument that's useful but doesn't ultimately ring true theologically or philosophically is defunct. Just don't use it. But we're listening to the word, but we also listen to the world. We need to think what's going on in the context that we're in and what's the best scholarship, not just Christian stuff. Otherwise, we're in an echo chamber. But it's not just the word and the world abstractly. It should always engage with one another in our everyday stories. So I'll do my best to listen to the story of the person that I'm engaging with. What's going on in their heart? What does that question mean? Why did they ask that question? They're some of the big ones for me in terms of healthy markers. And I think also a community. This is something we've both benefited from, is not being a lone ranger who just comes up with your arguments in private and then wheels them out, but someone who's in an ongoing conversation that has integrity about it, where you grow up through the giving and receiving of love and sharing of what you learn. I've benefited from so many friendships where, like I mentioned Bruce before, Bruce has done his, master's in intelligent design and philosophical arguments. He's done his PhD in arguments to do with abortion and the value of the human being. My friend with friendship with Simon Edwards, who's doing his PhD at the moment. Yeah, Edwards. Yeah, sorry, he's doing that on basically human rights and some of those arguments. Conversations in a community that help each other grow up and actually form better arguments and that are postured with humility, I think is pretty crucial. So they're some of the top 5 markers for me in healthy apologetics today.
Yeah, I've really appreciated maybe the growing friendships amongst those who are, I guess, quote unquote, in professional apologetics, or at least in the ministry of doing evangelism and apologetics as kind of a specialized calling. I think they're kind of like GPs in the sense where GPs are trained to know enough about a whole range of challenges in order to point people towards either a specialist or towards the right kind of remedy to know how to help people. You don't rarely walk out of a GP's office healed, but you better understand what's going on and have a path to move forward. And that's kind of the role I see them playing. But there's just this great friendship that's playing out across denominations, across traditions, where I just feel like that's growing, which is a healthy thing, because it does push us to think clearer. And even friendships amongst both the believing and the unbelieving community, amongst people of different religious beliefs or secular beliefs, where it's trying to sharpen towards better conversation rather than just throwing grenades in from the other side. So some of that is playing out, but there is still quite a combative environment online too. And maybe some of the fallout has been people that have had bad experiences of Christianity and religion. They've grown up in church and they've been told, don't study apologetics or don't study the Bible, because then you're going to come up with reasons to walk away. Or they haven't had their spiritual questions addressed within their local church community. And this is kind of a dynamic I want to speak to. We got a few questions that I'd love to get your thoughts on. One came from Ryan, who said, what does apologetics, which is primarily an intellectual practice, look like in a culture where many people are rejecting the faith more on emotional grounds, particularly those who end up deconstructing and walking away? How do you do apologetics in that environment where it's not just abstract arguments, but it's also more of the experiences and the kind of distrust that has grown, sometimes with intellectual bases, but distrust between people and the church that's meant to represent Jesus?
Yeah, that's great. I think, firstly, again, as I framed at the start, I don't see apologetics as simply an intellectual exercise or just simply reasons for belief. I think that's a very narrow reading of apologetics. I do see it as a putting forth of the reasons that I have for following Jesus. And that speaks
in
a
more
holistic
human,
way
right?
to the whole of life.
Yeah.
So for me, it always starts by taking a long time to listen to someone's story. I mean, I just think in the last couple of weeks, I've had that with a Muslim guy who basically his relationship fell apart with a good Christian girl who said, I couldn't marry you unless you came to faith. Fairly coercive. But I just heard his story for like an hour and a half. 3 hours later, basically, I'd been able to address some of his particular questions and concerns within his own language and acknowledge some of the issues. And so we just had a long conversation, but it always began by really long listening to his story. I chatted with a mum whose son has had mental health issues after a drug trip and basically feels that God is damning the whole world who hasn't heard about him, and listen to the story, prayerful throughout, try and show care. Chatted with someone who's Chinese, and basically they're going through a faith wobble and they're wondering about where's the riches in their own culture. Listen to their story, pray. And actually one of the things that I love the most is sometimes the best apologetic. I don't know if this has reflected a trajectory in my own life. I'm calling from our second bedroom. This is not a fake background. And you might notice that there's, on this, I can't quite tell where my hand is, but on this side, there's like an art piece, iconographic style of the Tree of Life. On this side is a kind of modern church with the kind of gamemanship sometimes that happens in the entry point. There's icons and owls and all kinds of stuff. And it might look a little bit crazy, but in my mind, actually the arts is one of the most powerful vehicles into where people are at. I don't see it as we just deal with the mind and they deal with art. I know that Alistair McGrath had made a big move towards using the arts in his storytelling and artistic pieces. I use movies so often. We just at a Labrie retreat and watched Wake Up Dead Man from the Knives Out series and had a 2-hour conversation afterwards about what is good and what is bad power, and is our posture to the world like one of the priests where we fight it, or is our posture to the world open arms? Actually, you can hit me, but I'm going to love you. So I don't think apologetics lacks in that. I think apologetics is simply the posture of humble, open engagement, starting from their story and bringing in your reasons to believe, but recognizing that sometimes your reasons to believe don't connect with them. I did my master's project in what I call triangulation, which basically means if I'm let's say I'm dialoguing with someone who's lost in a mountain climbing experience. Okay, let's say they're low down in a valley and I'm trying to locate where they're coming from. Basically, I'd say to them, okay, you need to find a stream or something and you need to follow the ridgeline and get up higher, and then describe what you can see on 3 very different angles. And then we can do a back bearing and work out, triangulate, where are you coming from? So in my mind, in conversation, I'm trying to triangulate where someone is coming from. And I do so from 3 different angles. The first one is the plausibility angle. In what sense do you feel that maybe the Christian faith isn't coherent or doesn't make sense to your reason? And then my aim is to open their ears by perhaps undermining the secularism or undermining the assumption that it's neutral or just smarter to be closed off to this. So I'm going to dialogue with reason at that point. I'll ask questions there. The second angle beyond plausibility is credibility. And essentially, this is to do with more empirical verification or evidence. I'm establishing trust through advancing credible truths. And I'll ask questions about how does this align or verify the way you think morally, the way you live, the kind of evidence we see historically. So plausible, credible. The third angle is relevance. I'm arousing interest by engaging experience. I'll draw on existential verification, their experience, and I'm trying to inspire them. So I'm not just challenging or informing, I'm inspiring. And in that kind of conversation, by asking good questions, they're coming up higher, and it's easier to work out where they're coming from and to meet them where they're coming from. But sometimes people switch. It sounds like it's all about the evidence, but then you get a little bit deeper and all of a sudden it's about their personal story and rejection from a family member when they were 15. And I need to pivot on a dime, not because I'm trying to win an argument or persuade, but because I'm trying to respond to where they're coming from. So I think healthy apologetics is fundamentally contextual and responsive, and it's dialogical. It is not agenda driven, but it's working with someone to honor them and help them find life.
One of the things I've noticed in getting involved in the social media side of questioning Christianity, because we do talks and we run training academy and all kinds of things, but we do a lot of video content online, is just how many questions there are now from people who have walked away from Christian faith. So growing up in the church and now describe themselves as ex-Christians or deconstructing or ex-evangelicals or whatever other label that they would take for themselves. And there is legitimate questions that are raised, and often it's concerns with Old Testament passages and the morality of God in the Old Testament, and they're great questions to ask and engage on. But that's more not the smoke screen, but that's the surface level symptom of a deeper mistrust that this story is bad news for me, because my experience of this story has been destructive or in the church environment that I was raised in. And so trying to get to the kind of heartbeat on, if God is real, is that good news for you? What would it look like if Christianity were lived out? The problem that you've experienced tends to not be that people were being too Christian, but not really Christian enough, in that they didn't capture the heart and dynamic of the way that Jesus lived out the kingdom of God. And so trying to address that real root cause, what's at the heart of it, is a trust dynamic of whether or not God really is good. And so having conversations around violence in the Old Testament or around slavery or certain Levitical or Deuteronomic consequences for actions that have been taken, and is this the ideal way that people should live today? Like, they're legitimate apologetics questions, but really trying to get to, hey, if Christianity is true, what is at the core of it? It's that the invisible God is made visible in Jesus, and that he is someone who, in the absence of having all the answers, is someone that you really can trust as well, and that he will bring good news into your world. And I think maybe if we were just to think about what, healthy markers for Christian apologetics today, it's a centering on God made known in Jesus, because there is always going to be degrees of mystery that are left. I cannot exhaustively answer the problem of evil. I can give you 12 different theodicies and where I think they're strong and weak. I can give you skeptical theism and the layers that adds. I can give you the meaning that God gives in suffering, or the hope beyond death that can carry us through the hardships, or my own personal story of the difference but I can't in every way answer the pain and dimensions of that question. What I can do is offer you the person of Jesus, who is far richer than any philosophy or knockdown argument. He's someone that you can trust and depend on, the one in whom there is no darkness. And so just thinking about the centrality of Christ in our apologetics and what we're really inviting people to. Well, can we talk about that community aspect?
I think all of that takes a community.
You go. Yeah. Well, speak to that, because I think there's a lot of pastors that are listening in, and people they're wondering, all right, I like apologetics. I can see what Wes does. I can see what Gavin Ortland does. I can see what others do, William Lane Craig, in that kind of space. I don't have that training. I haven't read those books. Is apologetics then, for the local church and the individual believer, where does it fit in? Right? If you're not called to have YouTube channels or to write books or to do all that kind of stuff, where would you say apologetics fits into Christian discipleship as a person is just growing in their faith? And where does it fit into the local church? Is this something that's on the shoulders of pastors? Should it be preaching series? Should it, like, if you were to say, I want to help churches become aware of the questions that people are wrestling with now and the dynamics that are out there, and better prepare them to give their reasons, what would that look like?
You probably remember one of the ones that we enjoyed doing most in the old days with Logos was a series, Quick Answers to Tough Questions. And we literally went out and surveyed about 600 people across our team in Roma Street Parklands, all over the place, and just asking what were some of the leading questions or objections to Christian belief. And out of that, we then formed a list of 20 of these questions or objections, and then we wrote responses to 10 of them, and then and did a couple of talks where we trained each person in the group to be able to, if you had at most 3 minutes to be able to respond to that in a way that has got integrity and is honest to you, what would you say? And then made that a small group resource that basically was used in the home groups to be able to train each other to do that. And we'd often, in the group that we formed of commission, where we'd train 12 people across a year to share why Jesus is good news to them, and then to try an experiment in evangelism that often includes apologetics. We'd often do the big story, designed for good, damaged by evil, restored for better, sent together to heal, God sets everything right. We'd basically get people to write their questions and objections. And if you had a minute, what would you say? That kind of training makes you sweat bullets, but at the same time, it's humbling and it helps bring you into a better conversation. I think the reality is that, again, we're not simply forming people to have some kind of abstract or spiritualized faith or emotional faith. We're forming people who are wise. They know the way the world is, and they know what leads to flourishing. We're forming people who are virtuous, who desire the good. And we're forming people who are skillful, who can work alongside their neighbor to seek flourishing. And that's what discipleship is about, learning to follow the way of Jesus in your particular time and place. So if church leaders are called to form these wise peacemakers, wisdom, virtue, skill, then you can't simply say, yeah, we can do all of that as long as we play the right songs, have a good sermon, and people feel therapized. You know, they come away and they're a bit happier than they were beforehand, but we never actually grapple with the deep questions. I think you're failing to do your job. It's not that it's some side bit. I mean, the fact that people have got questions, but as soon as you start to explore the reasons about it or the answers, they suddenly pull back and go, oh, I guess I should just believe, or I should just, maybe I'll feel better about it in the future. I'm like, that's like if you've got an occluded vessel, you start to feel the pains in your heart at about 80-90% occlusion. By the time those questions are coming to the surface, you're about to have a faith attack. And you're not going to solve that by just backing it off and saying, oh, let's just sing another song and feel good about it. Christ calls us to repent, and repent is metanoia. It's a fundamentally intellectual word. We are to rethink the whole way the world is and align with the mission of Christ. And to do that, you need to take it seriously. So I'll give one example. It's not a church-based example, but in my work at the moment with Associated Christian Schools, I'm writing a series called Questioning the Teacher. I'm working section by section through the Gospel of Matthew. And in each of those sections, I'm picturing that I'm a student in Jesus' classroom, because Matthew was used as the disciple-making textbook in some sense. And I'm picturing that I was that annoying kid in the front row, sticking their hand up going, yeah, but, like, sir, did you really just say that? And so what I'm doing is I'm taking an outsider's perspective on Jesus' life and his teaching in the Gospel of Matthew and saying, Jesus, why do you do this? Why do you say that? And I think until we are able to read the scriptures in our preaching, in our interaction, and adopt the posture of the culture's outsider, maybe the cultured denier, maybe it's the uninformed person, maybe it's the blue collar worker, until we can inhabit their mind space as we come at the scriptures in our faith, we're not actually helping our people grow to be able to live their faith in the public square. So I think in your preaching, be sensitive to those dynamics. For us, it meant forming groups that would not necessarily be experts, but draw in people who are thinking deeply and want to engage and get them in a conversation. We would do a series where once a term we'd present a message, and we would basically as a team work on that, each taking different areas. We'd read the books and pull our resources. We'd write the talks, we'd practice it 10 times, and then we'd actually have a day once a term or sometimes once a month in the original period where we would share that with the church and make a small group resource. And in the process, we had trained a group of about 12 people to know how to live and share their faith. We'd changed the culture in the church that this became normal. We'd built a home group that was growing in it, and we'd done mentoring towards that end. And I think all of those things are helpful. In my context too, we would run these open table events where we would have a theme that engages everyone, and we'd have some art, some philosophy that would stimulate them to come to the night and have a story to share in response to the theme. So it was story-based. In the process of that, you're learning to listen. It's dialogue-driven, but apologetics flows throughout it because you're each sharing the reasons for the hope you have. And I think in that context, it's a really healthy conversation. So there are just some ways that we found helpful to be able to engage that as a church.
Yeah, and I remember even in the list of books that you gave me, there was 52 on the list, but you had them in different categories.
Sorry.
And so there were some where it was, hey, this is just Christian theology, this is biblical theology, how to understand the big story of the Bible. There were others where it's more application, how do you follow the way of Jesus, and spiritual disciplines, and what religious practices look like, so you can become more like him in character. Some of it was history, some of it was apologetics, and some of it was biography. And so you had these different categories where apologetics wasn't the whole diet of Christian discipleship that we would be discussing, but it was part of it, because the hope was that you were preparing me to hear the questions and objections first from the lips of a Christian rather than from some skeptical intellectual online, or from someone who's deconstructing online, from some high profile science communicator or comedian or some other platform. You're like, no, I want you wrestling with these questions as a Christian, from a Christian source, saying these are serious questions. Here's where it challenges our beliefs. Let's explore and dig in. And I really appreciated that as part of my own discipleship, that it was permission giving, that doubt is a mega theme in the Bible. People are invited to explore and wrestle with God through their laments and their struggles and their questions and divine darkness. And just to be able to give me the permission to say this is a normative part of Christian life, having questions, reforming your thinking, growing in wisdom, drawing from wells that Christians have dug across the last 2,000 years and beyond, outside of the Christian world as well, to be able to grow up in your thinking and in your salvation, loving God with your mind. So individually, I really appreciate that. Appreciated that. And some things that you've just spoken to, I think, were really well modeled in Tim Keller's life, where as you listen to Tim Keller preaching, he's just wandering through parts of the Bible, but anticipating his own inner skeptic. And I loved even just recently listening to Dale Allison, a scholar who's heavily influential in the resurrection of Jesus, but himself, he says, there's four people within me at all times. There is the devout Christian who says his prayers every morning and goes to church on Sunday. There is the kind of goofball who is like, yeah, I reckon the world's weirder than we think, and I'm just open to all this stuff. There is the ardent skeptic, which is like, no, I've been raised in a secular 21st century environment where I just can't take these supernatural claims seriously. And then there's the academic who is incredibly measured in what I will and will not give credence to. And he's like, all of those people exist in me at the same time. And one thing about hearing the preaching that Tim Keller would do is he's just dialoguing with these different versions of himself and different skeptics and takes within his culture in a way where you're just training people to think through the more apologetic layers of what you're talking to. And so even now, whenever I'm doing exegetical preaching at my own home church, where I'm preaching once a month now, I'll always be in the sermon thinking through, where are the rub points for the person who's coming in for the first time to church? They've likely got their own internal skepticism, or for kids that have grown up that are watching the YouTube and TikTok videos and Reels and Instagram that I'm seeing, what are going to be the points that are worth hitting pause to address, and just feeding in little bits of maybe apologetic threads as to why you can believe the Christian story. Is this really good news? How do you address this concern, this doubt? Where do you be humble and say, yep, this raises questions that we don't necessarily have all the answers to? So I just find, even in my own responsibility to the church that I'm preaching to, that's a key element. But one of the things that I really appreciated your model of doing was trying to build communities of people where people could ask these questions, a small group community, draw out the resources, but also just identify there will always be some people within your church that are gifted, either because of their professional life or their own intellectual curiosities and capacity, or their own evangelistic hunger to want to share Christ with the world. Equip those people, raise them up, support, celebrate, bring them in, and in every way, try and help feed what they can bring to the table into the broader ministry of the church.
Yeah. And I think I would love to get back to that period in one sense where we had patrons of the arts What about patrons of apologetics? What about if actually the church saw that it wasn't simply about sending people to seminary, but we were to encourage the scholarship and the growth of people in a range of fields, almost like that kind of Renaissance picture of the rebirth. I know that this is happening through some different organisations around the world, particularly at Oxford at the moment, out of Wycliffe College. Jonathan Brandt is doing some wonderful work on Renaissance. But what if we were to encourage scholars in a bunch of fields and see them leverage that scholarship for common good and for the kingdom of God? I think the only other thing I'd add to that is in case he watches this, a shout out to my dear friend Mitch. Mitch and I have been friends now for about 30 years. Mitch is not a Christian. I have no idea whether he'd ever become a Christian, but he lost his faith or left his faith, I think frankly rightly so, in his teens, because it was religiously toxic. And we catch up probably every couple of months and have a good conversation, and I'm not trying to convert him or whatever, but the reality is that our friendship helps me hear all of these arguments and conversations differently. Cultivating friendships with those from a range of perspectives keeps us honest, helps us love, and if we can listen more than we speak and road test things and say, hey, I'm wrestling with this, what do you reckon about it? How does this strike you? And not as some subversive way to say, gotcha, now I've convinced you, but actually just let's cultivate an attitude in which we have genuine conversations with someone across lines of difference, and they call us friend and we call them friend. Jesus was a friend of tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, and also Pharisees. What if we were communities of friendship, communities of practice, cultivating scholarship with integrity? I think we'd all grow up in a much better way together.
I like that, mate. Well, thanks very much for being able to just shed some light on these sorts of questions. I just think it's healthy that every now and again we hit pause, just review what's going on in our culture in this particular area. How are we engaging? Are we actually pointing people towards Jesus? Are we becoming more like him ourselves in the way we engage in apologetics? If you were to put your finger on where you think the kind of most important questions are right now for Christians to be addressing, where might you land?
Well, I think there's still the intellectual questions, but I think most of our key questions emerge from what it means to be fully human and to live well. So if our vision is shalom, where is that breaking down? Where is relationship with God, neighbor, nature, self breaking down? I think on relationship with God, there's and with self, there's questions of what it means to be human that are raised by sexuality is certainly there, but AI is raising these questions. I think in terms of relationship with neighbor, the polarization, the echo chambers, war. I think we're in wars at the moment. So I think what it means to love our neighbor and to be able to deal with questions of like immigration, and some of these are public theology questions, but I think the gospel speaks to all of these in different ways. In terms of nature, we're facing ecological collapse in a whole bunch of areas. What does it mean that we worship the Lord of all creation? And how does that affect the way that we live today? And what does it mean in the mental health crisis to be people of peace who are non-anxious presences in a world that is blowing apart? I think the questions of, again, the particularity of Christ in a world of multiple paths, of many paths, but one door to God, and the question of the fate of the unevangelized or those who haven't heard, or questions of hell, these still, and suffering, these still do ring very true and are very deep for many, many people. They're perennial questions. But I do think some of those other questions, I think the last one I'd add is if the church is meant to embody the gospel, we've got some pretty serious questions to ask about the church. And that's where I'm very sympathetic to the outsider, because I think there's some unhealth in our churches. It doesn't have to look the way that it does. And people rightly ask questions when they say, you talk about the kingdom and Jesus and love, but then I go to this fellowship and all I see is people looking at the back of someone's head and hearing a message and then, cultivating ignorance, and how is that helping anyone? And I'm like, yeah, we need better forms of Christian faith that embody this kind of dialogue, which is why I've loved Labrie, why I love those kind of conversations. The third spaces where you can be honest, you're not expected to sign on the bottom line, but you can have a meaningful, rich conversation that engages the whole of your life. But I'd say the more holistic our approach is, the more we listen to our neighbors and just start with where they're at, the better we go. So you must be reading the newspaper, engaging in the public fora, but you need to, as Karl Barth put it, you need to read the paper through the lens of the gospel, through the lens of the Bible. What is God's mission, and how does the whole of life look different this side of the cross?
Mate, any parting words? Imagine someone's listening to this and they're like, I'm not sure what I think about this. I clicked on it because I'm pretty ticked off with apologists as well and this whole Christian advocacy movement. And they've gotten to the end, though, and they're just thinking, is there something in Christianity that's worth my time? Why is it worth believing? What maybe part encouragement would you leave with them?
I think I remember someone saying this once in terms of Christianity. They used the picture of it was Maxine Hancock, and she was saying, if I'm canoeing in a river, I can't get caught up in the little tributaries and eddies on the side, but actually the main flow and the best adventure is in the center of it. I'd say that deep orthodoxy. Go for the central questions, and the first question is, who is Jesus? I was chatting with a friend the other day who was coming up with all these objections. Actually, the Muslim guy was raising this, and I said, have you ever read the gospel? Have you read any of the Gospels? And it's like your own texts actually talk about the angels, the Gospels, the stories of Isa, of Jesus. That's the central text. Don't get caught up in 600 arguments. Read the text and say, what do I make of this person, Jesus? Where I've come to is, I literally, let's just say, even if I said he was just human, I don't see anyone who in their integrity, their courage, their compassion, their conviction, their wisdom, I don't see anyone who better models what it means to be fully alive and fully human. And I'm drawn to that. And then as I look at the life and the questions and the comments that Jesus made, he's claiming to be more than a good man. He's claiming to be God in the flesh, and he's calling us to align with a different vision. And if that vision was taken seriously, like the Sermon on the Mount, we wouldn't be in the crap we are at the moment in the world. Like, seriously, this isn't just a private therapeutic thing. This speaks to nation states. It speaks to what it means to love and seek the flourishing of our neighbor and even another's country, as intricately wrapped up with our own flourishing and the reciprocity therein. So I'd say get back to the center of it and look at the person of Jesus. Look at what it would look like if you actually lived this out. Is this the kind of person I admire? Is this the kind of person I take seriously? If so, what do I do with him? Because if it's true, it's everything. If it's not true, it's nothing, but there's nothing in between that. And so I think get back to the fundamentals, ask those questions, and do so in a community, and cultivate a practice of just genuine conversation. We shouldn't be so triggered by disagreement all the time. So I'm constantly giving people the freedom to say what they really think and thank them for it. And sometimes intentionally not arguing at that point, but just saying, I want to understand where you're coming from. Thank you for taking the risk and the courage to share that. And then just show that you can love people though you disagree. I think improving the quality of our disagreements is a great civic virtue, but I think it's a spiritual virtue as well.
Amen. Well, mate, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom on these questions. Everyone, I'm sure, is going to be commenting and thinking and just seeing where some of these threads land for them, pushing back and asking questions. Like, this is all healthy, which is great. If anyone wants to get in contact with Dave, he's now working as CEO of ACS here in Australia, but they can connect with you over social media, Dave Benson. He's just been a phenomenal friend, and you've left an indelible mark, not just on my own life and how I follow Jesus, but on the kind of pattern and style of what it means to serve him and reflect him to the world. So I just want to say thank you for that. Hopefully everyone else has been blessed just by the little bits that you've been able to share today. Everyone else who's been listening in, thank you for watching right to the end. If you can jump on, we've got hundreds of videos wrestling with many of the questions that we brought up today, many of the things that people are asking, from the reaction videos responding to those who have lost faith or have no faith, that try and engage with their arguments in good faith, all the way through to more substantive interviews like this. So please do check those out. If you want to connect any further, you can go over to questioningchristianity.com for articles or on asking your own questions for shaping more of the future content that we'll create. Otherwise, you can reach out if we can help in any way. It's been a privilege. Until next time, truth invites questioning. See you later.
See you later.